The night was heavy, cloaked in silence except for the distant hum of traffic and the restless cries of the city that never truly slept. But that silence shattered abruptly with the high-pitched wail of an ambulance siren tearing through the air. Its red and blue lights reflected wildly against glass buildings, flashing across like a desperate call for mercy. Inside that rushing ambulance, every second carried the weight of life and death. On the stretcher lay Sarah, her face pale and slick with sweat, strands of hair plastered to her damp forehead. Her swollen belly trembled with each wave of pain, and she clutched her husband Daniel's hand, as though letting go would mean falling into darkness. She was fighting not just for herself but for the child inside her, their firstborn, a life they had waited years to hold. Her breathing came in short, broken gasps, each weaker than the last. The paramedics hovered urgently, one checking her vitals, another adjusting IV drips, while a third leaned forward to shout at the driver to hurry. But as the siren screamed and the ambulance surged through traffic, the unthinkable happened. Ahead, in the center of the road, stood an obstacle no one expected, a sleek black luxury car with tinted windows, polished so perfectly it gleamed under the harsh streetlights. The car didn't move. Its engine idled as though mocking the chaos around it, its presence a wall between the ambulance and the hospital. The driver of the ambulance leaned on the horn, his hand slamming against it again and again, but the car remained still. Paramedics shouted, pounding on the back windows, their voices rising with panic. "Move! This is an emergency! Someone's dying in here!" Bystanders on the sidewalk turned their heads, eyes widening at the sight of flashing lights trapped behind immovable arrogance. Inside the ambulance, Daniel's chest heaved as fear clawed at his throat. He looked at Sarah, her eyelids fluttering, her whispers weak. "Please, hurry," she murmured. He felt his heart splinter, watching the woman he loved fight for her breath while just beyond the doors, someone chose ego over humanity. That someone was Richard Hayes. Billionaire. Tycoon. A man whose life was measured in power, luxury, and headlines. Sitting behind the wheel of his armored car, Richard glanced at the mirror and saw the chaos unfolding. But instead of moving aside, he remained still. In his mind, his time, his status, his presence on that road was more important than the desperate cries of sirens. He gripped the steering wheel, jaw tight, unwilling to give way, as though stepping aside would mean lowering himself to the level of ordinary men. The paramedics cursed, one of them stepping out into the street, pounding on the hood of Richard's car with his fists. "We have a mother in critical condition. Move this car." But Richard didn't lower his window. He didn't blink. He sat in his leather seat, eyes fixed forward, the world outside reduced to an inconvenience he refused to acknowledge. The traffic cameras caught everything. From the high poles above, their lenses recorded the ambulance stuck, the frantic paramedics, the motionless car, and the face of the man inside when the tinted glass reflected just enough light. The footage, silent yet damning, captured arrogance in its purest form. Time was bleeding away. Minutes stretched like knives across Daniel's chest as Sarah's grip on his hand weakened. Her lips trembled with every contraction, her skin growing colder. Daniel leaned close, whispering, begging her to hold on, promising her that help was near even though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. He banged on the ambulance door, tears streaming down his face, shouting into the street. "Move! Please, my wife is dying." His voice cracked with desperation, echoing into the night air. Finally, the ambulance swerved, forcing its way onto the narrow shoulder, scraping dangerously close to the barriers as the driver maneuvered around the car that refused to budge. The vehicle lurched forward, sirens still screaming, but the damage had been done. Precious minutes were lost, minutes that could mean the difference between life and death. At the hospital, chaos erupted as Sarah was rushed into surgery. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her, calling out instructions, wheeling her into the emergency room. Daniel was left standing outside the doors, his fists clenched, his chest heaving, tears blurring his vision. He replayed the image of that car in his head again and again. The man who sat inside, cold and unmoving, while his wife fought for her life. Hours crawled by in torturous silence. Daniel paced the waiting room, every to the clock a stab in his heart. Finally, a doctor emerged, his face weary, his scrub stained. He explained that Sarah had lost a dangerous amount of blood, that the situation had been critical, and though she was alive, she was weak, fragile, and the baby had been born fighting, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, wires attached to his fragile body in the neonatal unit. Daniel crumpled into a chair, his face buried in his hands. Relief that Sarah was alive clashed with grief for his son's uncertain future. He had never felt so helpless, so powerless against fate. But what he didn't know, sitting there in that hospital hallway, was that the world outside was already beginning to react to the truth. The footage from the traffic cameras was released online within hours. At first it spread quietly, a clip shared by a witness outraged by what they saw. But by morning, it had gone viral. Millions of people across the globe watched the horrifying scene unfold: the ambulance trapped, the pregnant woman fighting for her life, the paramedics pounding on the car, and the billionaire sitting inside, unmoved. Outrage erupted. Social media exploded with hashtags condemning Richard Hayes. News anchors replayed the footage again and again, voices rising with indignation. Commentators questioned how a man with such power could show such indifference. Outside Richard's headquarters, crowds began to gather with signs demanding justice. His name trended worldwide, not for his empire, not for his wealth, but for his cruelty. The empire he had built on pride and control was suddenly lapsing under the weight of public disgust. Back inside the hospital, Daniel remained unaware of the storm building outside. All he knew was his wife, pale but breathing, lying in her bed. All he knew was his son, Ethan, fighting for every fragile breath in an incubator. And all he knew was the image burned into his mind forever: a car that refused to move, and the man who chose arrogance over mercy. The days that followed were unlike anything Richard Hayes had ever experienced. For years, he had lived above the reach of ordinary men, his name synonymous with success, his face plastered across magazine covers, his voice powerful enough to sway investors and politicians alike. But now, everywhere he turned, he saw only hatred. His photo, once a symbol of triumph, was splashed across news screens with words like heartless, arrogant, inhuman. Online platforms burned with outrage, hashtags calling for boycotts, videos dissecting his every move, opinion pieces condemning him as the emblem of greed gone too far. For the first time in his life, Richard's wealth couldn't protect him. Business partners distanced themselves, contracts dissolved overnight, and investors pulled out of deals worth millions. Paparazzi hounded him at every corner, their cameras flashing like lightning, their shouts filled with contempt. His penthouse, once a fortress of glass and steel, now felt like a cage, its silence heavy with the weight of public judgment. Richard tried to fight back at first. He issued carefully written statements through publicists, insisting it had been a misunderstanding, that he hadn't realized the urgency, that he had been distracted. But the footage was too clear. Every excuse fell flat against the image of an ambulance blocked, paramedics begging, and a man unmoved. No words could erase that. The public's fury only grew louder, their voices united in condemnation. What struck him most, however, wasn't the financial ruin or the endless criticism. It was the silence when he was alone, the silence where his own conscience echoed. For the first time in decades, Richard had to face himself without distractions, without the applause of sycophants or the shield of money. And in that silence, he saw Sarah's pale face, the desperation of her husband, the frantic fists of paramedics pounding on his car. He replayed it every night, unable to escape the truth. He had chosen pride over life. Unable to endure the suffocating walls of his penthouse, Richard eventually did something no one expected. He went to the hospital. Cameras followed him, of course, their lenses eager to capture every second of his public humiliation. He walked into the building carrying a bouquet of flowers, so large it seemed more like a performance than a gesture. He wore his most expensive suit, the very image of a man who had always tried to control how the world saw him. When he entered Sarah's room, however, the performance fell apart. There she lay, pale but alive, her eyes heavy with exhaustion yet glowing faintly with resilience. Beside her sat Daniel, holding her hand, his gaze sharp as a blade when it fell on Richard. There were no words of welcome, no gestures of forgiveness, only silence that cut deeper than any insult. Richard stood there, clutching the flowers awkwardly, his mouth dry, his rehearsed speech dissolving before it could form. He began, but the words withered on his tongue. He looked past them, to the incubator where Ethan lay, tiny and fragile, his chest rising and falling with effort. The sight pierced him in a way he had never felt before. That child could have been lost. That child was nearly gone because of him. Suddenly, the weight of the flowers in his hands felt absurd, pathetic. He set them down clumsily on the table and stood there, speechless, while Daniel turned away without a word. The cameras caught everything. The billionaire, stripped of arrogance, standing powerless before the family whose suffering he had caused. The footage spread across the internet within hours, but this time it wasn't met with outrage alone. It was met with something else: disbelief. Could a man so untouchable truly be humbled? Or was it another act, another attempt at saving his reputation? The public argued fiercely, some demanding he be punished, others daring to hope he had learned his lesson. Richard left the hospital that day in silence. For weeks after, he disappeared from public view. Rumors spread of bankruptcy, of exile, of a man ruined by his own arrogance. Yet behind the scenes, something different began to unfold. Without cameras, without announcements, Richard started to act. He began pouring his fortune quietly into hospitals, funding new emergency lanes across the city, donating ambulances and equipment to clinics. He set up a foundation in Sarah and Ethan's name, though he never dared to approach them again. For Daniel and Sarah, life became a slow climb out of darkness. Sarah regained her strength day by day, her smile slowly returning as she held Ethan against her chest, listening to his small but determined breaths. Daniel worked tirelessly, juggling jobs and hospital visits, carrying the weight of fear and hope in equal measure. He still thought often of Richard Hayes, of that night, of the anger that had burned inside him like fire. But each time he looked at his son, alive against all odds, he felt a different fire, one of determination never to let bitterness define him. Months passed, and the storm around Richard began to fade. Not because people forgot, but because they began to notice the changes he was making. Ambulances funded by his donations appeared across the city, each bearing no name, no logo, only the quiet symbol of compassion. Streets were redesigned with clear emergency lanes, ensuring no one could ever block life again. Slowly, whispers began. Perhaps he had changed. Perhaps guilt had forged something new in him. 1 year later, on Ethan's first birthday, Sarah sat in their modest home, holding her son close as family and neighbors gathered to celebrate. Laughter filled the air, music drifted softly, and candles flickered on a small cake. Daniel stood watching his wife and child, his heart heavy with gratitude. They had survived the unthinkable. They had endured pain, scars, and sleepless nights, but they had come out stronger. He bent down, kissed Sarah's forehead, and whispered, "We made it." Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the city, Richard Hayes watched the news alone in a modest apartment far removed from his former empire. The segment was brief. A story about a child who had just turned 1 after surviving a difficult birth. The camera showed Sarah's smile, Daniel's proud eyes, and Ethan's laughter as he grabbed at the candles. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in his life, he wasn't watching his own name on the screen, but it didn't matter. He felt a strange peace knowing that, somehow, his failures had forced him to become a different man. He raised a glass of water to the television and whispered softly, though no one would ever hear, "Happy birthday, Ethan." And perhaps, in that quiet, Richard Hayes found the first real moment of humanity in his life.